it's like my whole body is screaming. When it's good, I think it does feel like there's something bursting out of me, like out of my chest, as if there's like a second self that's inside myself that bursts out and is like on the ceiling.
Hello, so this is Jess. We go into who she is and why she's on the podcast right at the top, so I won't cover that. But what I will say is a couple of disclaimers. Jess suffers with fibromyalgia. I ask her how to pronounce it within the first 2 minutes, then proceed to mispronounce it for the rest of the app. If you want to play a drinking game where you take a shot on every time I garble the word, feel free to get duffed on me. I'm so sorry, I've got a soft G, what can I say? Also, second disclaimer, we get into a chat about what a sex marathon is, how long a sex marathon needs to be to qualify as a marathon. And I have questioned myself throughout the last couple of weeks since we recorded it, thinking, am I really that lazy that I have so little endurance? In the past, I've definitely had longer sex than I admit to in our chat. Have I? Do I? Look, I'm in a long-term relationship. You get to a point where you just don't necessarily need to attend to each other for longer than it takes to bake a jacket potato. Do you know what I mean? Is that a bad analogy? Because they actually take quite a long time to bake if you're doing them right. Maybe not. Maybe it's the perfect one for exactly that reason. Okay, I'm not here to tell you how to bake a jacket potato or how long to have sex for. If you're having sex during this pandemic, congratulations. I've hit an absolute wall this week. Who hasn't? Jess is a tonic. I will say that. Great link. Fantastic work, Helen. She gives you all sorts of reasons to be hopeful in this situation and others. I'm excited for you to hear it. If you haven't got to the point of sharing this podcast with anyone yet, what are you up to? I think before I started making one, I never even considered reviewing a podcast online. Yes, I'm one of those. And now that I make one, I realise how important it is, and I am encouraging you deeply to not be former me. Give us 5 stars on iTunes, write a review, rate us wherever you listen, share it with a friend, or 5,000. I will drop all of Jess's socials in the episode notes as per. She's top quality on Instagram. I realised after this conversation she's not actually technically an influencer, but seems quite pivotal to my social media landscape, which suggests, or at least a friend said to me afterwards, means I'm a stalker. I stalk her. I didn't think that was the case. I'm still questioning it, as you can hear in the way that my voice is going upwards. Why does the intro always end with a massive truth bomb from HD? Oh, goodness. I'm also going to drop in some info about fibromyalgia, charities, information sources, plus the book that I discussed by Gabby Jackson, the Guardian journalist, called Pain and Prejudice. It's a brilliant read. I would highly recommend it. I think that's everything. Yes. Oh, I know that you can bake a jacket potato in 2 minutes in a microwave. I don't have one, don't at me. Love ya. Here's Jess. Jess, I don't know how to introduce you. I'm also so intrigued by so many of your potential titles, like queer writer / librarian. I just said librarian incorrectly as well, which makes me sad. But it sort of sounded like I'd said librarian, as in you bring libations, which in some ways you do, to queer feminist literature.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether I can even call myself a writer anymore, because I haven't really written anything in about 2 years. I've cut down my hours now because of my fibromyalgia. So hopefully I'll be able to have some energy to do that, because it's just been a case of getting this job in the library, loving it, thinking that can support me to do my writing, but then kind of being quite unwell, not knowing why, and only managing to sort of do my work and nothing else outside of that. So I moved to Brighton and wanted to leave everything behind. I really did do that. I left everything, I completely just stopped doing anything that I did in London. And I think the time has come to sort of start reintroducing the bits of myself in London that I still want to have.
So interesting that you introduced it already, and I'm really pleased you said it, because I've read it so many times, the word fibromyalgia.
I didn't know how to pronounce it for ages. In fact, weirdly, my sister's a clinical psychologist and she runs a fibromyalgia clinic, which is why I knew that I had it, because I don't know what I thought, really. I think a lot of it was dismissed as mental illness, because you do get chronic pain and things with PTSD. And it was her that said to me, I'm really certain that you've got fibromyalgia. You should go and see a rheumatologist. But yeah, I've been saying all different things. But yeah, it's fibromyalgia.
And it's similar but not to chronic fatigue syndrome, is that right?
Yeah, it's very similar. In fact, they're almost indistinguishable, and they have so much overlap that it depends who you see, what diagnosis. My understanding is that it often depends what kind of clinician you see as to what diagnosis you get. And certainly I experience fatigue as much as I experience pain. I think there's very little research and very little kind of idea about how to treat chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia. So it's sort of been a journey of finding what works for me and trying to adapt my life around it.
I've just read a fascinating book, I told you about it, I think, called Pain and Prejudice, which is by an Australian Guardian journalist. And it's all about medical bias, as in towards the kind of white male straight body as being the norm. And then a lot of different disorders, illnesses that affect women, either in ways that are dissimilar to the ways they affect men, or that only affect women or primarily affect women, are really under-researched, underfunded, because things only get funding when they become issues for straight white men. And fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome come up a lot because the journalist, her kind of starting point is that she suffers with endometriosis, and then she starts to kind of look wider and think about a lot of the syndromes that can cross over with endometriosis, and people to have multiple disorders that link in with endometriosis. And with things like chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, there isn't a clear understanding of what's causing it and how it can be fixed. And so often people are either misdiagnosed or dismissed, quite often dismissed. And so how has that been to be on the receiving end of that system and to still be able to be with your body if people are saying to you, you're presenting in ways that we don't recognise, or there's nothing wrong with you? I don't know if that's happened to you, but...
Yeah, I mean, it has my whole life, really. And I think it's interesting because I almost cancelled my appointment with the rheumatologist who diagnosed me because I said to my girlfriend, I'm fine now. You know, there's nothing wrong with me. I felt like I was being hysterical. And that's very much the way that I think I've been made to feel by a lot of medical staff, is that I'm being dramatic and seeking attention. The fibromyalgia got diagnosed after my health really deteriorated when I had an ovarian torsion in March. I was walking home from work and I was suddenly in extreme amount of pain. And what happened is I had a huge cyst on my left ovary, and it had got so big that the ligament holding the ovary up twisted 3 times. The cyst burst, and my Douglas pouch, which is an area of the body I didn't know existed, but apparently I've got one.
Name, isn't
ridiculous.
It? Yeah.
I mean, is it named after someone called Douglas? I don't know.
It must be. Come on. Otherwise, it could be their dog. Maybe it's their dog. Douglas the dog.
That filled up with blood, and I was in absolute agony. I managed to crawl into an Uber and get myself to A&E. And I was vomiting up on the floor of the emergency department, shaking. I could barely tell anyone what was wrong with me. And I saw a doctor who looked about 12, and he said that I got cystitis and sent me home.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. I was begging this nurse. I said, I haven't got cystitis. There's something really, really terrible is happening to me. I've never been in so much pain in my life. And no one believed me. So I had to go home, and then I came back at about 5 o'clock in the morning, having spent all night sort of shaking in my bed. And eventually they took me seriously. But I had all sorts of nurses come up to me with their sort of take on what was wrong with me. One nurse said, "Oh, you've just got your period, love." Another said, "What have you taken? What have you taken?" Thinking I'd taken an overdose. And it was such a frightening experience because I knew that something really terrible was happening to me, which it was.
So fascinating.
And no one believed me.
Two different nurses could come up to you with such wildly divergent diagnoses. Like you must have had an overdose given the way you're responding. And then someone else is like, you must just be having a really bad period, which says a lot about the ways in which women are just expected to get on with pain. Like if the way you were reacting, vomiting on the floor, writhing around in pain, and advocating for yourself, saying this is really unusual for me, was possible to be dismissed as just like, oh love, you've got bad cramps. It says so much about how much torture we're expected to just put up with because it's part of menstruating.
And then afterwards, when I had my ovary removed and I started to recover from the operation, and I felt that I wasn't really recovering, and it had been a number of months, and I was still very, very tired. And I'm usually a very active person. I seem like a hyperactive child a lot at work. People don't understand where I've got my energy from. And I'd gone from kind of going for long, long walks in the Downs, doing 10K runs, to really struggling to just go and get my groceries. And I'm quite lucky in that my GP took me seriously quite soon, but there was a period of time where it was dismissed as just my hormones. And they gave me estrogen, thinking I was potentially going through a bit of an early menopause. They couldn't test my hormones at that time because we were in lockdown. So I was given estrogen, and it seemed to get better for a while, and then it got worse again. So I went to see a rheumatologist probably about 4 months ago now.
So in terms of timeline, has that been the last 2 years or so, what you just described there?
No, that's just been this year. So I started to notice symptoms over the last if I really think about it, probably over the last 5 years. But I didn't recognise them as an onset of fibromyalgia until it got to a point where I couldn't get out of bed. And that was when I knew that there was something. It wasn't just PTSD, that there was something else that was physical. Although there is a big link between trauma and fibromyalgia, and I'm very interested in the way in which trauma shows up in your body and about the connection between physical and mental health, which I've been reading a lot about. And I think that's been really helpful in taking ownership of my recovery.
So often the reason why people are dismissed as being hysterical, which is like a really historical way of dismissing women's symptoms, right, is because it's seen as being all in their head. And so if, in fact, something you're suffering with affects your body physically, and as a consequence affects your mind, and then there's a feedback loop that's created, so the physical symptoms are exacerbated by the anxiety or the concern that's caused in your brain, or the stress, and then that goes back and forth, like hitting back and forth like a pinball machine, then it is true that it's occurring in your mind as well as in your body. So in a way, being dismissed as hysterical, it's quite easy to fall into the trap, I think, of thinking, I am being hysterical.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have, because I do feel a bit loopy.
Yeah, I think so. And also, pain is created in your brain. Pain isn't created in your body. And so it is all in your head. And that can be really frustrating because sometimes I'm in extreme pain and I think my brain is just creating this. There's nothing wrong with my muscles. My joints and my muscles are physically fine. There is physically nothing wrong with me. My nervous system is oversensitive in the same way in which sometimes, with trauma, you experience noises as much louder than they are. You feel oversensitive to the world, and tiny things can maybe trigger a meltdown. And it's just the same, but physical. And the diagnosis has been really helpful for me in being able to seek help at work feeling like I'm able to advocate for myself, asking for what I need, and feeling less hysterical. But it's interesting to me that I see that as a more valid excuse or reason for taking time off work, for example, than I do if I'm struggling with my mental health, because it's one and the same. And yet I would never feel able to say, sorry, I need to take some time out. I'm feeling really triggered. Absolutely not. But if it's physical pain, I feel able to advocate for myself in that way.
I think also we should just reiterate. So saying at the library.
Yeah, at the library.
I have such a lovely image of you when you said earlier. I used to be really hyperactive.
Yeah.
And everyone at the library was like, everyone at work, you said, was like, wow, how can you be doing so much? I just imagine this kind of fairy like buzzing around the library, putting books away. Did you really want this? Do you know yourself? How well do you know? So if you're able to say at work, I can't do this because I have fibromyalgia, how does that then map onto your relationships and your relationship with your girlfriend, but also with yourself, even in terms of getting frustrated?
I think it's really affected my sex life. I mean, orgasms are easy for me, are too easy sometimes. I've never had a break. So the first time I had sex with my girlfriend was the night before lockdown number 1, and we moved in together the next day.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was really a very classic lesbian U-Haul, which I think was quite common during lockdown 1. We were friends before that, but it became.
Did you say U-Haul? U-Haul.
Yeah, U-Haul. So that's,
I've never heard that phrase before.
It comes from American trucks. U-Haul
I
trucks.
wondered.
Yeah, and it just means basically the classic queer moving in very quickly, which, I mean, it wasn't really a U-Haul because I kept my flat and I've moved back there now, and it was always a temporary thing.
So the U-Haul element represents you like bringing trucks worth of stuff.
Yeah, which I kind of
dumping
did.
It. Right.
Boris made the announcement and we got in the car, went back to my flat, and I packed 2 suitcases and just moved in.
And is that because you'd been friends before and there'd been something bubbling up anyway?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And we both live alone. So I think neither of us were working at the time. I was still recovering from my operation and also was then furloughed. And Sarah was a student nurse, and she was kind of had a period of time when she wasn't doing a placement. And the first time we had sex, I came after about 30 seconds. I was fully clothed, just from rubbing against her leg, and I was crippled with embarrassment. I felt like a 14-year-old boy, and I thought I was like, I've really messed this up. She's never gonna want to have sex with me again. So that's kind of how easily orgasms come to me, and it's always been like that. So
and this is when you're still recovering from
an operation,
major surgery.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to laugh, but you're such a jammy bitch.
I know, and I do. Honestly, and I think particularly with feminine women, I have this feeling inside of me where I feel so overwhelmed because I just think they're so pretty, and I feel like a 14-year-old boy who is like losing his virginity. Like still, every time been together almost a year, and I'm still just like mesmerized by her. I mean, there's probably been one time where I struggled to orgasm with my fibromyalgia because I'd taken a lot of codeine. I think it's affected my sex life more in that physically, sometimes I'm just too weak to do the things that I want to do. Mm-hmm. And that feels really difficult for me. Sex has always been a really important part of my life. It's the part of the relationship that I feel is easiest. And I feel like I don't need to worry about anything because I know what I'm doing. Like, this is my area. I can take ownership of this, and I feel confident sexually. And with my fibromyalgia, this has been the first time really that I haven't felt sexy. I felt like an invalid. I felt old. I felt like, oh, I can't be in this position because it's hurting me. And, oh, I've lost my sex drive today because I'm in so much pain. Or we're going to have to stop because my neck is seized up. And I know that if I carry on, that's going to cause me a flare-up of pain for 2 or 3 days. So it is frustrating because it feels like my mind and my body are in two different places. And so in my head, I'm like, yeah, I want to have a 4-hour sex marathon. And my body is like, no, I want to be in fetal right now.
Right.
I don't want to do anything.
So for me, I don't think I've ever had a 4-hour sex. Actually, I lie. I might once. There was a guy that I got with after a Wiley concert, and he was a personal trainer. He kept telling me during the sex, and the whole session was like, and I say session quite deliberately, it was like probably he was maybe like the third person I've ever had sex with. In my early 20s, it was a one-night stand, understandably, like, because it was exhausting. The whole thing felt like I was being put into positions and like, it was a workout. So that was quite long and deeply dissatisfying. But that's the only example I can really give of a sex that's taken, I would say, over an hour. Now, I know that says a lot about me. It's just an observation that you're going from a place of like maybe having quite an elaborate, exciting sex life to start with, to then, as you say, feeling like an old person who doesn't want to do anything other than kind of sit in a chair and read.
Yeah.
So is that right? Would you say that your sex life was enviably glorious?
Yeah. People always say I should write a book about my sex life because I have so many stories. But people at my drama school who didn't go there when I went there, I remember them coming up to me in theatre, Soho theatre bars, being like, "Oh, I know you. You were that girl who had like a threesome in the tutorial room," which I never did. There were two different things that got merged into one. So I think sex has been almost an addiction for me through my life. I would leave the cinema halfway through a film if I got a booty call. Everything revolves around that, which I don't think is healthy. And I think I've sort of moved on since then. I don't have 4-hour sex marathons every time I have sex. But yes, it's been quite a difficult process of having to really adjust my sex life and adjust my expectations of myself and kind of rethink and redefine what good sex is. Because I think I put a lot of pressure on myself to perform and to be like, if I don't go down on my girlfriend for 2 hours, I'm not doing enough, and I'm bad in bed. And actually, good sex doesn't have to be about having 8 orgasms and having a group of people. It doesn't have to be that. I think I was trying too hard.
I feel like you would be knackering to have sex. I think I would be crying, begging, being like, honestly, it's enough. It's enough. I'm done. I promise you I'm done. Yes. Can I ask you about this relationship you're in with Sarah? Because Sarah's trans. I just wondered if that element of her experience has been interesting for you. I guess you're both holding space for each other because you're both in places where you might be exploring kind of new sides of yourselves, given like what you've been talking about and I don't know Sarah's situation.
Well, the girl that I was with before Sarah was also trans. And I have been in sort of sexual relationships with non-binary people and trans-masculine people. And I think dating trans people or people who are just queer in general has allowed me, it's given me permission, I think, to explore my own gender, which I've been doing this year.
Oh yeah, I've seen that because of your amazing haircut.
Yeah, I cut off all my hair, which I'd been wanting to do for years and was too frightened to do. And I think being with people who are so confidently themselves and so unapologetically themselves in a world that is saying it's kind of not okay to be who you are at the moment, especially in this country, that's the message, is so inspiring. And I think I have suppressed my own masculinity for all of my life because I've not seen it as something that would be accepted or attractive. It's been really, really cool to be able to explore that this year. And I think also the lockdown and COVID has given me permission to do that because it was just me and Sarah. I mean, I've pretty much just seen Sarah, and I think having that safety of having someone who, I mean, Sarah won't give me any indication about how she would like me to dress or be, which I found quite frustrating at first, because I just wanted to be like, oh, I want to be how you want me to be, like, you know, and I always found myself dressing for other people or presenting myself in a way that I thought would make people fancy me, whoever I was fancying at that time. I was like, I would try and work out what kind of person they wanted and then be that person. And Sarah refused to give me any indication about how she wanted me to present, because she genuinely doesn't care. She loves me for who I am. And that was terrifying, but also gave me such an opportunity to explore a side of myself that, yeah, I didn't even really know was there.
When you say you've been exploring your more masculine side, what's that looked like or felt like?
It's weird because since I remember it was drama school, so I must have been about 20, I started having sexual fantasies about having a penis. And that's been kind of my go-to masturbation material is I have a dick. And I never really thought about it. I just thought like, oh yeah, like all girls think about having dicks. Like that's just a normal thing, right? And it wasn't until I kind of, you know, was having queer sex and I had the opportunity to have a dick because, you know, I can do that. That led to me thinking about my gender in general. I don't think I'm probably as masculine as I've been presenting recently, because I think I've really swung into like being like presenting in quite a butch way. And I think now I'm swinging a little bit back to being like, okay, I've explored that being really masculine and I don't think I'm probably quite there. But
is it fudge? Is it femme butch?
I've always said I'm fudge.
Which is I love that as a word. It sounds like when your welly gets stuck in a puddle and is struggling to get out. Like it sounds like that sound. I know it's squelch technically, but I think futch is better.
Yeah, that is it's a really good way. But the feeling is the same. I've always felt genderqueer, and it's interesting that when my presentation changed, people took that seriously. Whereas previously, if I'd expressed to anyone like, oh yeah, sometimes I feel a bit butch or a bit like a gay boy, people would just be like, ha 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 ha. But like as soon as I cut off my hair, people are like, oh yeah, tell me about that. Like I'm taking that seriously. And I think sometimes I think I almost wanted to present in a very masculine way for a while so that I was seen, because I think people can be quite dismissive. And I think particularly people who are not queer think that like being non-binary or being genderqueer is all about like fashion statements and the way that you look. And it's not at all. Not, you know, non-binary can look like anything. I think there's a pressure to match your gender identity with a gender presentation that is androgynous or that is expressing something that is internal, really. And I'm also constantly aware of like the privilege that I have to explore my gender presentation without risk of harm, because firstly, you know, I'm white, I'm middle class, I live in Brighton, and I'm assigned
I love that that's the end of that.
And I'm assigned female at birth. If I was someone who is perceived to be a man and I'm exploring my gender presentation with makeup and wearing dresses, society views that in a very different way. And I wouldn't be able to walk down the street and not be harassed. But as someone who is still perceived to be a woman, essentially a woman with short hair, I don't really get any shit for it.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting that like, I think women expressing masculinity tends to be a lot more, not always, but tends to be a lot more acceptable.
I really liked what you said about Sarah. The fact that Sarah was so powerfully herself allowed you to feel that you had the space to explore yourself and also to be more connected during sex. I think that's a really fantastic statement to be able to make about any relationship, regardless of who you're with.
Yeah. I really think that Sarah is the first person who I've had sex with where I'm not in some way performing a role. Before Sarah, I hadn't really been in a relationship since I was about 20. So For me, it's always just in bodies clashing and like powerful explosion of like physicality. And it was very difficult at first because she is a lot more emotional with sex. She tends to have sex with people that she already has an emotional connection with, which is the opposite for me. You know, when there's an emotional connection, I'm like, oh, bye. I like sex to just be purely bodies, but that can't happen with someone who you love. And it was quite frightening. And there were moments where it felt like too much.
It's not the physical sensation that's too much, it's the emotion.
Yeah. And the physical sensation tends to happen almost more easily when I disconnect emotionally. One of the reasons I think that sex became kind of addictive for me is that it took me out of my head. And it's interesting talking to people who have difficulty orgasming, and they always say the same thing: I'm too much in my head. And I feel like one of the reasons I sought sexual experiences so fervently is because I wanted to get out of my head. And it allowed me to do that because the feeling of being in my body was so much that I didn't have to think. And it was one of the few times where I didn't feel worried or, you know, I was just purely in my body. It's very similar to getting into the cold sea for me.
I've said before in this podcast, the day after, I actually had my first orgasm in Brighton. And the day after, the morning after, I was on my own and I went for a swim in the sea. And it just felt like everything coming together in terms of like this pure sensation, just the cold, tingling. I love it. I love cold water swimming, especially in the sea. Because of the motion as well, you're overpowered by something that is beyond you, that is always going to be a much greater force than you. And I love giving up to that, giving myself over to that.
Me too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very powerful, very powerful.
Turn that off, I need a wee.
How has having an orgasm interacted with fibromyalgia? Is it a moment of release still?
It is a pain relief. It does relieve pain. I have to say, when I have very bad pain, I don't tend to want sex. I used to joke that, you know, I'd have a virus and I'd still be horny. And so it takes quite a lot.
Which in these times is a damning indictment of you as a person. Just willing to spread it. It's you. You're the guidelines. The new guidelines that need to be introduced to get this virus under control.
Oh, God. When it's kind of mild to moderate, I can have sex. There was one time recently where I couldn't come. And it was probably the first time in my life that apart from, you know, sometimes we've all had those experiences when we're with a kind of a boy and he doesn't really know what he's doing and you just think, oh God, this isn't going to happen at all. Obviously, Sarah was doing everything right. She really knows my body. I couldn't come and we were both so shocked because I mean, usually it's like, I'm like, don't touch me there because I will come immediately. I really have to do everything to try and slow down the point before orgasm because it happens too quickly, usually more quickly than I want it to. But yeah, it was really just not coming, and I was in pain, and I think it was because of the pain, because I could feel the pain more than I could feel the sensations of the sex. Yeah, that was taking over, and it was really frustrating, and also made me feel again like an invalid, and not sexy. So Sarah's a very emotionally intelligent person and has taught me so much about communication. She makes me feel very safe in all aspects of our relationship, including sex, and I felt safe enough to explore things sexually and like otherwise that I haven't been able to in previous relationships because we have so much trust. And I think the difficulty has been in times when I've been really unwell and she's been looking after me. And that makes me feel like I'm being parented or that there's a sort of carer dynamic, which is difficult to feel sexy in.
Yeah, if there's trust in a relationship and there's space for people to be honest, it doesn't really matter about where you're... Well, I was going to say it doesn't really matter about where you're coming from, but often if people have been through things that are quite challenging and force them to really look at themselves and to do some work in terms of who they are, who they want to be, you, having had that experience yourself, you then are able to make space for other people.
Yeah.
I've certainly found that in my relationship with my boyfriend, for sure. He's made lots of space for me, and I think has only been able to do that, has had those kind of skills because he's been through some stuff himself.
Yeah. I mean, so I really hope Sarah writes a book about her life. I'm not going to give you her life story, but it's really fascinating, and I find her so inspiring as a person because she has every reason to feel bitter and angry, and she doesn't. She has so much love for so many people, and she is so kind, and she has every reason not to be, because the world hasn't always been kind towards her. And that inspires me to find that in myself, because I can feel I'm quite a bitter bitch. I can feel myself, especially with this fibromyalgia, sometimes getting really woe is me and feeling like, God, it's just not fair. What have I done to deserve this? Like, I just want to be able to go for a walk, really simple things, you know. I just want to be able to work in a library and for that not to cripple me because I'm so tired all the time. I really want quite simple things in life. Feeling like allowing myself to just feel those feelings, but then love people and be kind to people anyway, has been so healing. And yeah, I don't know how I would have got through this year without her, really.
And you want me to... with my elbow. Okay. That's actually a perfect place to ask you about what for you an orgasm feels like. And also feel free to describe them across your sexual life, because it sounds like they might have changed quite significantly.
Yeah, so from when I was 15 to 25, I could only come through clitoral stimulation. And that for me has quite a different sensation from the orgasms that I have when I'm penetrated. And so I just accepted that I could only have like clitoral orgasms, and they tend to go, they're sort of on a graph, they go up and then down. When I was 25, I had my first orgasm through penetration, and that feels a lot more intense and a lot more sustained. I mean, I think they're like snowflakes. I think all orgasms for me feel different. Someone who I slept with once said that I come so hard, it's like my whole body is screaming. And that, I think, describes it very well. It sort of feels to me, when it's good, sometimes I have orgasms and I think, really, was that it? But when it's good, I think it does feel like there's something bursting out of me, like
out of your chest,
out of my chest, out of just like as if there's like a second self that's inside myself that bursts out and is like on the ceiling.
You did some arm gestures there that people won't be able to see, but it was quite biblical. It was like the second coming.
It is very, very biblical. But yeah, it does feel like quite a spiritual experience, I think. Yeah, and quite kind of cathartic. I often cry afterwards, or I have hysterical laughter, which is quite embarrassing when it's with someone new. But it does feel like such a release.
God, no wonder you're addicted to them. So that was Jess. I told you she was a pick-me-up, didn't I? If you want to contribute to the making of this podcast, please pop us some pounds, pennies, dollars, whatever you've got to spare in our Ko-fi, ko-fi.com/Helen Duff. This episode was edited by the brilliant Daisy Grant, and the podcast is produced by me, Helen Duff. Lorna, Treen and Daisy Grant. I am doing an improvised comedy gig this Wednesday. I run a gig called Makers of Meaning, where we improvise cast and crew interviews around a real film this month. It's Yentl, directed by, co-written, produced and starring Barbara Streisand. Each month that means me and a bunch of non-binary and women improvise around a film that has been made by a woman, either written, directed or produced, pre-2000, and we have a lot of fun. Tickets to that can be found at the same link that I put out with all of the podcast stuff, the link tree, and you would be very welcome. It's free. We invite contributions afterwards, but it's open to all. It's on Zoom, and it also goes out on Facebook Live on the Makers of Meaning Facebook page. So we will see you there, 7:30 on the 17th of February, and it's every month. So next month is the 17th of March, the following is 14th of April, ad infinitum. Well, until the pandemic eases, then we'll check out what we're doing on the live gig circuit. Okay, I love you listening, love having you to make this for. And with that in mind, we are already gathering our guests for season 2. We've got some bangers in the tank booked already. But if you have people in particular who you think, that person is a really interesting insight on orgasms and has an experience that we haven't necessarily covered yet, it would be really cool to hear from you. Bearing in mind that we still have a fair few episodes to release for this season. Super. Fantastic. Lovely stuff. Have a good week and be kind to yourself.